Welcome to the Money Maze podcast. If this is your first time joining us, I'm the host, Simon Brewer. Technological revolutions are by their nature rare events. The printing press, the internet, mobile telephony, the attendant excitement can capture the imagination, spur a raft of associated breakthroughs, encourage investors to dream of the extraordinary returns, yet its byproduct is often to create excessive short-term exuberance and expectations that might be correct in time, but invariably take longer and lead to investor disappointment. AI is the new game changer, but how will this play out? Who are the architects of this new landscape? Will regulation stifle or stimulate progress? Does it recalibrate productivity? Do we have the electricity to support it? And are we creating a force so powerful it may lead to the destruction of our own civilization? And how is AI being integrated into the burgeoning cloud industry? To understand this better and to try to climb above the often superficial chat around AI, we wanted to find someone who, along with their organization, is at the epicenter of the revolution, developing, harnessing and monetizing. So who better than Microsoft's Scott Guthrie? Scott, welcome to the Money Maze podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, I'd like to set the scene for listeners and viewers. We're at the London Stock Exchange Group's headquarters here in their offices, in which Microsoft has a 4% stake, and we'll be coming back to that when we talk about financial services. But for those who do know me, they will be thinking I am the wrong person to be asking probing questions around technology. We'd like to welcome a co-interviewer today, Rob Rooney, who was Chief Executive of Morgan Stanley International and ran their $6 billion annual technology budget for several years, which involved working with Microsoft to develop their cloud business. He's now the CEO of HyperLayer, a rapidly growing fintech business. Rob, welcome to the Money Maze podcast.
Thank you, Simon. Great to be here. Great to see you again, Scott.
Great to see you again too, Rob.
Okay, so we just want to dial back briefly. Scott, what was the first dollar that you earned?
The first dollar I earned was actually, I had a paper route here in the UK, in fact, when I was, I think, 13. And then the first technology dollar I earned was I was a Fox Pro developer and built a early database CRM system for a company here in the UK.
Right, and you go to Duke to study computer science, which I now read is the largest major at Duke,
Yep.
And joined Microsoft, I think, in 97. And so for those who haven't done the maths, which I've been able to do, 27 years at Microsoft. I think Rob was at Morgan Stanley 32 years. I mean, I have to ask you both, what was the glue? What is the glue?
Well, for me, I've had different jobs across those 27 years, and it's been a fascinating industry, and the challenge of doing new stuff and learning new technology, and being fortunate enough to be at the center of several big computing waves is what's kept me where I've been at. But it's felt like a different job every year, so it's not always been the same job.
Rob, tell me why the same for you?
I think it's similar. I can't say every year, but I feel like I had about 5 careers at Morgan Stanley. And then I think the culture of the place was really fantastic for me. And I had some great colleagues and mentors to learn and work with. So it just, the 30 years flew.
Let's jump into the cloud. And this is where, of course, Rob, in a conversation years ago, I remember you said, we turned to Microsoft. Just set the scene. What problem were you trying to solve?
So I took responsibility for Morgan Stanley's technology organization in the beginning of 2017. And at that point, Morgan Stanley, which has always been a tech-leaning organization, had come through a period after the crisis where budgets were tight, but those were finally being liberated, and we had to go really fast. And I think the key point was, how are we going to be able to innovate faster? It wasn't really about storage and compute and getting that cost down or making it better. Morgan Stanley's kind of data center stack is pretty good. All our leaders there, Morgan Stanley's leaders there. But bringing in innovative partners across the ecosystem, they wanted to be in the public cloud. And so we turned to Microsoft. Morgan Stanley was a Microsoft shop already, and it made a ton of sense for us to turn to Scott and his colleagues, who already had a huge amount of credibility inside of Morgan Stanley, to help us. And
explain to us, because my limited understanding, Amazon was already sort of on that track, and Microsoft then suddenly becomes a major competitor. Tell me a little bit about how Microsoft was approaching that business, and then that will lead us into thinking about what's ahead.
Yeah, I think so from the public cloud perspective, Amazon had a few years ahead of us. And, I think had done a great job in particular with consumer startups, which in the early years of cloud was kind of the main market. because they didn't have data centers. They weren't going to be able to build their own data centers, and so they looked for public cloud. And when Azure and Microsoft kind of emerged in the public cloud space, one of the strategic decisions I helped drive was to sort of say, well, look, I don't think people right now are looking to Microsoft for consumer startups. Certainly not in 2010. We weren't seen as big in the consumer space. We weren't big in open source. And, I kind of sort of said, I don't think going after that market is going to be successful for us, given where we are entering late. But, companies do value us in terms of the business and enterprise relationships. People do have, like Morgan Stanley, investments on premises today. And so let's be the cloud for business. And so we very much kind of built the cloud business at Microsoft to be really great for enterprises, really embrace hybrid computing from a very early day, and really enable organizations to transition to the cloud on their terms in a much easier way, and to do it in a way that could really meet all the enterprise security and compliance requirements. And that was sort of our original sweet spot. We've expanded. We now do have a very big startup business and a very big consumer business in the cloud. But that focus, I think, on really putting enterprises at the center was key for us breaking through in what was back then an early crowded market. I think Azure was the number 8 cloud provider when I took it over in 2011. Today, it's us and Amazon are kind of number 1 and number 2. And I think if you look at businesses, probably Azure is bigger at this point than the other cloud provider. And, we continue to grow and expand. And I still remember working with Rob in the very beginning and talking to him from the very get-go. And it's been great working with Morgan Stanley, and a lot of credit to Rob and his team. I think one of the decisions they made, which was a really great one, was also as they moved to the cloud, they didn't want to just lift and shift their existing technology. They very much had a practice of let's modernize and move to really take advantage of the full cloud as we do it. And I think that kind of approach was very mature and very ahead of its time when you made the call. And I think that's really helped Morgan Stanley as it's made its move into the cloud and be very successful with it.
And help listeners understand what is the premise of the cloud's function and how is that going to change? And I'm always told we shouldn't ask 3 questions at once, let alone 2, but I couldn't get my hands around what the penetration is of businesses in aggregate who are, using the cloud as opposed to not.
I think at this point, pretty much every business on the planet is probably using public cloud in some way, shape, or form. Maybe not entirely, but certainly 20, 30% of workloads. And in particular, I would say new workloads is now, in many cases, it's the majority of workloads inside organizations. And I think the reason people have looked to cloud comes down to a couple of reasons. I think one is if you're a business, say 20 years ago, a lot of your interactions with customers were maybe in person or they're on the phone. These days you need a mobile app, you need a website, you need to have much more of a consumer grade experience if you're a bank or you're in the financial services space, or certainly if you're in retail or insurance even. And so having data center infrastructure, having a set of services that can scale to hundreds of millions of users that might be hitting your experience, and having really great performance, really great capabilities, and that kind of consumer grade, I think is now just needed for every enterprise out there, almost every enterprise out there. And a lot of enterprise data centers were not built with that in mind. And so the public cloud gives you a way to kind of build those types of very finished consumer grade experiences. And then I think the other big advantage of the cloud is what we call the elasticity of it, which means that, if you are a bank, there's certain times of the year, take tax periods or even elections, where you might want to scale up your resources far more. And then there's other times of the year where it's a quieter period and you might want to scale it down. And that ability with the cloud where you're not having to pay for fixed compute, but you can instead increase your resources or decrease your resources on demand and only pay for the minutes or the seconds that you're using, can lead to real economic savings. And so from a cost perspective, I think that's the second reason why people use the cloud. And then I'd say the last reason is just to be able to take advantage of cutting edge technology. And I think, especially when you think about AI in particular, that requires lots of GPUs, that requires lots of CapEx. Many organizations probably couldn't justify spending tens of millions of dollars on speculative hardware for AI versus they can pay by the hour in the cloud. They probably can find good reasons to use AI, and they can start to experiment and move much faster in terms of integrating it into their solutions.
Well, I want to talk about AI in the cloud in a minute, but let's just move to AI. When I asked Copilot, your search engine, to define for me, a Luddite, the difference between search and AI, it said search engines are like super efficient librarians. They fetch relevant documents based on keywords and popularity. AI aims for depth and nuance. Just set the stage so we can all understand what allowed this huge leap forward.
Well, the big leap forward, I mean, so the machine learning's been around for many decades, probably even. And in that sense, it was often a case where you take data, it could be like a data set of like ticker price data or financial data. And, you kind of look at predictive patterns over a very fixed domain of information. And you're kind of effectively predicting the odds or the likelihood of something happening. And that was kind of machine learning for many, many, many years. I think what's really broken through with AI is this concept of kind of large AI models, where instead of being very narrowly focused on a specific domain, it can actually synthesize vast amounts of information. And what's been a breakthrough is being able to take written words, so books, textbooks, as an example, or even video podcasts even. You can take audio transcripts or even the raw audio now from a podcast or from a video feed, and you can actually train the model on this additional information, and you can start to enable AI models that can understand and reason over a lot more things, and not have to require you to train a very specific narrow use model, but you can actually apply it in the case of, probably a lot of people on this podcast have used ChatGPT or Copilot. You can ask natural language questions and get an answer back over a wide range of different topics. And this has really been a huge breakthrough in terms of how models are trained the last couple of years. And obviously we're starting to see this natural language capability really democratize the type of things that you can use AI with.
So I listened to you speak earlier on at this LSEG Tech Day that's been full of fascinating conversations, fascinating people, way above my pay grade. But you used the expression AI is helping you bend the curve on innovation. I wonder whether you could just explain that and maybe even illustrate that.
Yeah, I think, an example I'd use to pick a different innovation wave, and I think the type of thing that we're going to see over the next couple of years would be like the smartphone. If you go back in time, say a year or two before the iPhone was introduced, when I used to come to London, you'd buy a map. You'd actually, you'd be scared to leave your hotel room or, too far from the hotel because you weren't quite sure if you could find your way back without getting lost. And if you wanted to go to a restaurant, you'd, go to the concierge and see if they could book it, or you'd wait in line. And, now when I come, I just plug in the maps and, if the tube, I can buy my ticket on the tube, I can get an Uber if I need to. And, I can book a restaurant anywhere in London with, one or two apps and see all the recommendations and reviews. And, that's completely transformed the experience. And I think the same is true for personal finance. The same is true for health apps. The same is true for, exercise. There's so many domains that just have completely transformed because of the smartphone. And, I think the same thing is happening with AI right now, where things like ChatGPT as an example, people couldn't anticipate it even arriving 5 years ago. And now, the numbers of people that are using it on a daily basis is, often the tens of millions. And I think you're going to see the same thing in terms of whether it's developers that are coding with new capabilities like GitHub Copilot is transforming kind of the overall development process and how you build new applications. And I think you're going to see it, say, in the financial services space, in the way that, say, Morgan Stanley, for example, has a website and a great mobile app today. I think in the future, as a client, I'm going to ask it natural language questions and say, okay, tell me how my portfolio is exposed to this factor or this factor. And it's going to give me an answer that isn't, here's 8 PDFs to download, but it's going to synthesize those PDFs and put information in front of me. And, the financial services companies that use that technology first, I think are going to win more business. And I think the same is true in every industry, whether it's insurance, whether it's in certainly retail, whether it's in travel, hospitality, et cetera. And so I think this opportunity to really bend the curve of innovation, I think, is how do we build new experiences, often that we're going to put in front of consumers, but also that we might use for internal business processes that really lead to kind of breakthroughs and dramatic innovation or dramatic improvements that lead to more revenue or lead to substantial cost savings and productivity.
On the surface, we might have two separate conversations, or at least listeners might think so. There's Azure and the cloud, and then there's AI. Can you pull them together for us? Could you be who you are in AI without Azure? And would Azure be what you want it to be if AI wasn't coming on so strong?
Probably no to both of those. I think one thing that is unique about these large models is just the sheer amount of compute you need to throw at them. I mean, it's one of the things that I've said in various conferences is we're currently building 500 data centers around the world, which is an insane number.
Yeah. Yes, it is.
We're bringing online nuclear reactors now in the United States and elsewhere around the world because we need the energy to power these types of facilities. And just the sheer amount of GPUs that we're putting together on extremely fast networks is just sort of mind-boggling compared to where we were 3 or 4 years ago. And it's both a technical statement of just technical sophistication of how to make this happen. And it's also, frankly, a capital investment perspective. And, if you look at our earnings the last year, people have noticed, wow, there's a lot of CapEx involved here. So you got to get both the CapEx right and the technology right in order to kind of build these this AI infrastructure. And so, I do think, would OpenAI have been successful without Azure? They certainly needed a cloud provider like Azure to do it. And I think a key part of our success together has been they've done tremendous innovation. And then we've also, both invested in the infrastructure in particular, and then built it out for them so that they can actually both train their models and then ultimately scale solutions like ChatGPT, and then expose those as APIs that Copilot and other great AI technology, both from Microsoft as well as AI products from others, are built on top of. So I think something like Azure is desperately needed. And then I do think, as you think about the cloud business, one of the things that certainly helped us the last couple of years has been, I'll call it the AI tailwind, where people are seeing the AI revolution happening. They know that Azure's helped create it. And they're all very interested with their organizations to figure out, okay, how do we integrate AI? How do we bend the curve on innovation, to use the previous question, in our own organizations with our own products and our own services? And, I think it certainly helped us, the Azure business, where we're seen as kind of the center of the AI revolution happening.
So financial services, you've taken a 4% stake in the LSEG group as part of a 10-year partnership. Just set the scene for what the motivation was.
Yeah, Microsoft has always been very focused on horizontal platforms and products. You think back to our early days, whether it's DOS or Windows or SQL Server or Office. They're products that can be used by companies in every industry, and often they're what we call platforms. So in other words, it's a database, or it's a server operating system, or it's a client operating system, and those platforms are only interesting if you have applications running on top of them. No one wants to buy a database just for database sake. It's the application that uses the database that matters. And so part of our strategy at Microsoft has always been, how do we partner deeply with companies that are in vertical industries, and how do we help them be successful building their own applications that run on top of our platform and now our cloud? And part of what has made LSEG so compelling as a partner is they are very big in financial services. They sell to all the big banks, hedge funds, broad range of buy side, sell side, et cetera, across the financial services space. And, they don't compete with banks. They're providing services that banks consume and others in the financial services world work with. And so, we've had a great partnership and saw them, in particular, a lot of their data set assets, a lot of the workflow tools that they're building, as something that where if we could partner with them, we could actually take our horizontal capabilities at Microsoft, so Azure, AI, data as an example, but also things like Teams and Copilot and Office. And if we can take the goodness of our horizontal with the goodness of LSEG's vertical industry financial services experience and kind of marry them together, we can build ultimately solutions that make our mutual customers more successful. Mm-hmm. And we've done this in other industries as well. Epic Healthcare would be an example of a great partner in the healthcare vertical, and we have similar in retail and a wide variety of different other industries. And but it's been a great partnership. I've actually been on the board of LSEG since the beginning of 23, and so it's been great to work with them, and we're excited because we're starting to really now start to ship the products that we've been working on the last 18 months and get great financial services companies using them.
So being part of critical infrastructure is nothing new to you and nothing new to Microsoft. And I mean, Office played that role for some time, but boy, this is going up. With Azure being what it is, with AI and your role as a company in AI going as far and wide as it is, your expansion in financial services, there's a lot of dependencies that people rely on when it comes to a lot of things, including healthcare that you guys are big in. But boy, when it comes to money, you got to be open and you got to be right. How do you all manage that? You're becoming more and more critical infrastructure every day.
It's a tremendous responsibility, and and it's not something we take lightly. It is absolutely. I mean, nothing matters if you don't have good quality and if you don't have good security. It doesn't really matter what other feature or capability you have. And so, I'd say, even within our teams these days, 80 to 90% of all of our engineering investment comes down to quality and security, and that AI innovation is often in that 10 to 20% that's left over. But, we've been very clear with our teams, if it's a choice, you got to pick security, you got to pick quality, and you can't trade those off. And it just becomes more and more important as everything is digitized. And so it's, you even think about like manufacturing as an example. Assembly lines don't work anymore if the cloud is down.
Yes, it's everywhere.
It's everywhere. Hospitals can't admit patients, financial services can't trade or transact. And so it's, retailers on Black Friday, it's tens of millions of dollars per minute of orders that flow in, not just on that day, but really the entire November, December season. So it is definitely a lot of responsibility, and it's something that you also kind of need to be very systemic about. And so also when we're driving quality and security initiatives, I think the other thing we've realized, it's not just about fixing bugs, but it is also trying to, how do you design the system in the case of security, so you have multiple defenses in depth. And then in the case of quality, how do you also really design with architectural principles so that many, many, many things have to go wrong in order for there to be customer impact. And the bar keeps raising in terms of expectations. And so you're never done with either quality or security. And I think it'll always be the thing that we invest 80 to 90% of our time in going forward.
So when we staying with financial services, because for listeners who didn't, David Schwimmer, LSEG CEO, was on a few months back, and he would have surprised many people when he said that actually London Stock Exchange revenues are less than, I think, 7% of total businesses, because this is what is one of UK's preeminent data businesses. And it's actually very exciting listening to what's been going on. But the financial services world is being disintermediated in so many ways. I want to come back to you, Rob, because you're CEO of this financial services fintech business, HyperLayer. Just give us a sense of how you are using the things that we've been talking about and what's changing.
At HyperLayer, we're not intending to disintermediate financial services at all. Our thesis really is some of what you talked about, Scott, is missing from financial services. If we put our iPhones on the table, if we had iPhones or Android phones, whatever, and we showed them to each other, they'd all be different because we will have configured and personalized them for our own purposes. But with little to no exceptions, you can't do that today in financial services. If we looked at our HSBC apps here in the UK or our Chase apps in the US, they would be identical except for the numbers. We think that that is a big miss for customers, but it's a big data miss for the banks and the financial services providers. Scott knows the big secret in tech is when I personalize my tech, my phone or my apps, I surface a lot of data that tells the providers a lot about me. A lot of that's good for me because then I get a bunch of services and products back at me that are appropriate for what I want. And that's been missing for financial services. And our little company has really invented that capability. But it generates a lot of data. So for every person and every bank transaction, we generate about 10 times the data artifacts that currently exist today, which is going to be, in theory, gold dust for AI recommendation engines. So Scott will be coming at you pretty quickly.
Great.
Because there's a lot of data and a lot of AI power that our customers are going to need to take advantage of this.
But let me come back to my point about disintermediation at the level where financial information is consumed, because we know the ubiquity of the Bloomberg terminal, and yet at the same time we've got this vast library of data shifting and changing and growing under LSEG's umbrella. Do you foresee a transfer of the way in which data is consumed in the financial space?
I think you're going to see, I think the way to answer it, if you look at history, in technology, there's been platform shifts that have happened, every 10 years at least, going back a long time. Think about the move from to standardized PCs in the early days. IBM and compatibles was a massive shift from the previous era. The move to graphical user interface, in particular with Windows, was this massive shift. The move to the web was a massive shift. I think mobile was a massive shift. And I think AI is going to be a massive shift. And I think one commonality, if you look at every single wave, was that companies that leaned into the transformation and were aggressive about updating their portfolio, embracing the technology, were usually the winners. And the companies that did not, or they took their time, or they're a little bit more cautious, were the losers. A story I always like to tell is if you look at Microsoft back, if you go back to 1991, 1992, Microsoft was not the largest software company in the world. Most people think it was. Microsoft's been around, for 50 years this year. But it was actually Lotus that was the biggest software company, and they were the dominant company. And I think even WordPerfect might have been the second largest company. And, Microsoft was the sort of number three. And, and both Lotus and WordPerfect took their time building graphical user interface solutions. They said, we've got a lot of customer demands with our current system. We'll get there. And, Word and Excel came out of nowhere and became dominant within 2 or 3 years. And because people said, I want to buy the new thing that was more powerful. And I think similarly, if you look at the web, Amazon was a river, back in 95. And it was, the bookseller to begin with, and then became a dominant e-commerce site. But, that could have been someone else. Netflix, everyone thought Blockbuster was going to win the streaming battle, but Netflix moved quickly. And I think if Blockbuster had shipped their streaming service a year or two earlier, it might have been a different outcome. And, again, I think you see these parallels, and I think we're going to see it with AI. And so going back to your question, will it be disintermediation? I think the companies that lean into the technology and get there first have enormous advantages of install base and customers and data assets. And, if some of these organizations, take advantage, like Rob's technology, or take advantage of AI, I think they have the ability to kind of have real competitive differentiation. And I think also if some of those companies wait, I think then they do open themselves up to a certain amount of risk in terms of a disruptor coming in and potentially capturing the minds of both consumers as well as other B2Bs. And, it's the importance of first mover advantage, I think, really matters with platform shifts.
Got it. That's very clear. Productivity and employment. We had Rob Arnott, he was a guest on the show, Research Affiliates. He recounted that 18 months ago when AI was emerging, he said to his group of employees, everyone's hearing about AI. It's a big deal. It's going to change everything. I want to reassure you that not a single person in this room, not one of you, is at risk of losing your job to AI. You may be at risk of losing your job to somebody who knows how to use AI better than you. Tell me a little bit about how we think about job redundancy and job opportunities in this world?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think if you look through, in general, I'm bullish on this is going to be good for humanity and good for jobs. I think if you look through history, starting with the Industrial Revolution, every time we've invented technology that makes humanity more productive, it has led to greater GDP growth, it has led to more jobs, and it has led to higher paying jobs. And I think, whether it's the steam engine, whether it's railroad, whether it's, the postage stamp, I mean, all those things led to kind of better economic outcomes and better jobs and higher paying wages. And I do think AI has the ability to also be an accelerant from a productivity perspective. Now, I think the thing that is true is that while it is good for humanity, it's not always equal in its distribution. And so I do think there will be roles that will be impacted or disrupted by AI, in the same way that, there were a lot more saddle makers before the automobile arrived. And so while it might be better for a city, it might be better for a country, it might be better for the population, I don't want to dismiss the fact that it will be unevenly distributed at times, and there will be some roles that'll be potentially more impacted than others. But I think our belief at Microsoft, and part of the reason why we call it Copilot is it's not called autopilot, it's called Copilot for a reason, is how can we provide tools to employees to make them more productive? And if you can actually enable an employee to get 40% more output and be more successful, I think you're not going to replace that employee. They're going to be more valuable. Hopefully you end up paying them more. And more importantly, the company's business grows faster. And that's kind of our mindset approach in terms of the Copilot solutions that we're building.
Yeah, and I saw in the survey that was done that tech developers using Copilot were significantly happier as a result in their job because of the tool.
GitHub Copilot is a great example where, some of the statistics that we quote and now, other people have done surveys. It's for development tasks, it can be up to 50% more productive, which is a pretty astounding number.
Yeah, huge.
And it's been quantifiable because you can measure amount, code tests, deployments. And so it's actually sometimes easier than say email productivity or other things where, it's harder to kind of get a raw set of numbers, but this is fairly quantitative. And the big question is, does that mean that half the developers in the world are going to be out of work? And the answer is no. It's actually companies are finding, no, I actually get more out of my development, my technology investments going further, and I'm going to invest more in technology because for every dollar I put in, I'm getting more out. And I think that would be my hope with the Copilots that we're building for other scenarios, and with LSEG for the financial services industry. It's not about replacing people. It's about how do we enable them to be more successful and then ultimately have more fulfilling jobs?
And could you, both of you, actually point to maybe one or two things every week that this facility, Copilot in the case of your engine, is doing to make your life more productive?
For me, one of the things I enjoy the most about Copilot, it's actually an internal Copilot we use, so we have not shipped this as a product. But it is our internal incident management system, or ICM system. And so every time we have an issue, whether it's an outage or something that needs to be done urgently, we create a ticket effectively to track that issue. And so this internal system will automatically page in people. So like send a text notification, have them join. And what's super fun is if they don't join, then we kind of go up the call chain. And eventually I get texted, which is not as fun, but,
I've been on those calls.
You're on those calls. Yeah. And often when there's an incident, like if there's a quality issue or something that we're being worked, you might end up bringing in 20 engineers onto a call, and they're all working it in real time. They're all very, there's customer may be impacted. So, there's a lot of, energy, lots of work streams going on, and coordinating all of this is hard. And, the Copilot we now have actually takes the audio from the Teams call and the chat as well as the telemetry, and now will summarize the incident and what's going on, what's been worked, what the current hypothesis is, and what is the customer impact. And it basically every 60 seconds gives me an update in real time of, what is a very complex, sometimes confused set of conversations with a lot of side conversations and side bridges. And now I can just, on my phone, I can actually monitor it in a meeting, and I can kind of decide, do I need to join it, or is it being worked and it's underway? And it's, helping reduce what I call the fog of war, is great for me. And it, more importantly, it means that we resolve incidents faster. And I think if you think about whether it's a trading desk in financial services, where you think about, a default risk, or you think about, technical incidents, or you think about, if you're a manufacturer, supply chain, they all have the sort of similar dynamic of you need a lot of information. There's a lot of verbal communication. There's a lot of data signals. How can you kind of show the forest for the trees and separate out the noise? And, AI, it turns out, is sometimes better than really good at that and helping synthesize and provide that clarity.
That's a great example. Rob?
Yeah, we're a team shop, and we use that function. And, if you're raising money or you're talking to customers and you're talking to lots of them, you can get themes out of those that my brain doesn't remember. And that's pretty critical. I'd say it's also, I get the answer faster. So search is just completely differentiated now. I'm not kind of scrolling through pages or randomly going down rabbit holes. It's not always right. So you got to be eyes wide open. It's getting better. And then lastly, I think for some people who are getting emails from me, they may have to acknowledge that I haven't written every word of them anymore. And I still have to edit because my unusual style still has to be imposed on the robot, but these are big time savers. It's a really big deal.
Wow. I've definitely got some learning to do. I did see when you put up an example on this afternoon on the screen of what Teams was doing to synthesize and conversation and arrive at conclusions, I was going, wow. So energy. A search on generative AI platform uses 10 times the energy of a Bing or Google search. Microsoft has purchased the shuttered 3 Mile Island. You've got a net zero pledge for next year. How do we think about, the reconciling those and this apparent vast new energy consumption?
Yeah, one of the things that we committed to a couple of years ago before AI, it was a little easier before AI, but was to, by 2025, to basically be 100% renewable energy across our data centers and our cloud. And we're still on track for that, even with AI, for next year. And so, we will be putting in more renewable energy into the grid than we pull out from it, pull out energy from it, which is...
so that's net negative, really?
It's basically from an energy renewable perspective. There's also, concrete in data centers, there's steel, there's the silicon manufacturing process. And so we also have committed to be net negative by 2030. Wow. And so we still have 5 more years on that. And, part of, I think, to get to net zero for all organizations, there is this challenge, which is you really got to go deep in your supply chain and your, sort of scope 3 emissions all the way down. We're working deeply with our suppliers on that, and it's really a team sport across every industry. But from an energy perspective, we will be at 100% renewable next year, and it's hard because AI does use a lot of energy, and part of how we're doing that is needing to really partner with energy producers as well as grid operators. And so examples like you mentioned, Constellation Energy is bringing back online nuclear site plants in Pennsylvania, and those in the U.S. If you've heard of 3 Mile Island, it's not always in the best connotations because there was a plant that had an issue in the 1970s. That one is not being brought online. Let me reassure you. It's the one that did have an issue is not being brought online, but the other ones are, and they've been mothballed because 5 years ago it was not possible to raise money to invest in them. And so Constellation is going to take, I think it's 5 years or 6 years to actually renovate its completely modernized equipment. And it'll be 100%, net zero energy that'll be added to the grid. And part of what Microsoft's done is committed to basically buy many, many, many years. I think it's maybe 20 years worth of energy from them. And so, that's given them the confidence to invest in this really critical energy project that's going to ultimately produce a lot more green energy, not just for us, but for the East Coast of the United States. And we're doing similar deals and partnerships with grid providers around the world. And, I think one thing that's true almost for every country as they're going through energy transition is that most companies most countries are not only struggling to get green energy into the grid, but the grid itself is struggling. And so taking the electrons from where you inject it to where the consumers are, in a lot of cases, the grid just wasn't designed for it and can't handle the fluctuations, weather changes, et cetera. And, even in the United States right now, some of the investment in the grid has been challenged because of wildfires and other events that have happened, like in California. And so a lot of investors have been hesitant to invest in actually improving the grid because they're worried if there's a lawsuit, could the company go bankrupt and they effectively lose their investment? And so part of what we're also doing is a bunch of partnerships where we basically commit long-term contracts to consume the energy, which in turn enables the investment in the grid, which again benefits not just us, but benefits consumers and other businesses all over the world. And I think that type of partnership is going to be needed so that we can actually meet our overall global goals around climate change.
Got it. Well, we've talked actually quite a bit on the podcast over the last couple of years of uranium and why it's such an interesting opportunity, along with gold, but I won't go there. Let's talk about regulation, because it was observed by Scott Besant, the hedge fund manager from Key Square, who came in that, in China, the PRC must remain omnipotent. In the US, it's the Wild West. And in Europe, it's all about regulation. And in fact, I think it was Spectator said recently that Europe is making itself the champion of technology regulation, which doesn't seem as productive as just getting on with it. Are you surprised by these variations? And we're sitting here in the UK with a lot of good stuff going on. How do you reflect on those theaters?
Well, I think one of the things that we've said at Microsoft over the years, we've been around for a long time, and we've seen different types of regulation. And I think it's important to recognize anytime you have a very powerful technology, whether it's the web, whether it's computers, or whether it's AI or cloud, you need to lean into regulation. You can't sort of say there will be no regulation and argue for that. You need to really work with governments, because governments do have a responsibility to regulate and make sure that their citizens and their economies are kept safe and privacy is observed, et cetera. And so I do think we're kind of not trying to say at all that there shouldn't be regulation. I think the trick is going to be how can we ideally create a partnership both across governments and then across the private sector, so that the regulation keeps people safe and secure, and at the same time is not doesn't have negative consequences in terms of either creating bifurcation or creating stifling innovation in certain places that can make a country uncompetitive economically. And so, we've been, it's a partnership. We're not trying to claim we have all the answers, but, we've leaned in very heavily, whether it's the UK government, whether it's the French government, whether it's the German government, whether it's the EU broadly, or the US government, to make suggestions on what it would look like, to bring together even different governments around the world to be able to kind of discuss and see other common standards that all governments could adopt, so that each company doesn't have to kind of navigate 50 different regulatory environments. I think if we do that, there's good pragmatic outcomes that are wins for everyone, and I think can ultimately ensure that this technology is both has powerful impact in a good way, and at the same time is safe, secure, and meets all the compliance and regulatory requirements that countries are going to expect.
I have a question on everything we've been talking about for the past many minutes. Is the implication of this is the big are getting bigger on your side, to have the scale of the resources to do what you all are doing is really quite something. To be investing in grids and nuclear and to be talking about regulation at the country level, a partnership with the UK. You got to be pretty big to do all of that. So how do you all manage at Microsoft this thesis that huge and innovative don't seem to always go together? That's not the story, right? Innovation is small and nimble, the big slow down and they ultimately die off. You guys have clearly fought that off for 50 years. I didn't realize it's your 50th anniversary coming up. Happy birthday. But how do you all think? How do you innovate? How do you partner with smaller companies? I mean, to move the needle on $3 trillion of market cap isn't easy. How do you balance the need to be huge with the need to stay on the cutting edge?
I think there's an element of for us, especially in the early years of Microsoft, I'd say the first maybe 30 years, there was kind of a, I don't want to call it paranoia, but it was, we didn't take anything for granted. And I think we always felt like existentially we're going to go out of business in 2 years unless we execute super well. And I think that some of that came from Bill and Steve and, this sort of someone else is going to clean our clock unless we bring our A game, I think was kind of very much in the DNA of the company. We really didn't take anything for granted. And, and I think we went through a period where, we got a little bit more distracted in the early 2000s, and we missed, we in some ways were very successful in the internet browser and server space, but we missed search, we missed social media, we missed mobile, fairly catastrophically on all three. And, I think around the era of like 2011, 2012, 2013, I think there was a lot of us that were lifers that felt like, we're not going to go out of business, but are we going to become irrelevant? And, part of the big transformation we went through, I think really, to his credit, starting under Steve and then in particular under Satya, was really saying, we're not going to miss cloud. And, we really invested heavily in cloud and that was really part of the rebirth of the company. And I think similarly on AI, I think we have a similar amount of, I call it kind of founder mode mentality of, we have a meeting with our senior leadership team every Friday. When I was telling Rob earlier, it's kind of when I flew here to the UK, I landed at 2:30 on my Delta flight from Seattle. I took the tube into my hotel and I managed to get to my hotel 15 minutes before, my 7-hour management meeting with our senior leadership. And we do it every Friday. And so people are always like, really, you meet that long every Friday? And it's not, we kind of have a way of talking where we say like, let's not have success theater. Let's not talk about anything that's going well in this meeting. Let's talk about all the problems. And it's not always the funnest meeting because we're always talking about, all the hard stuff that isn't going well. But I think that's part of the mindset that we've tried to adopt that's helped make us successful because, it's very easy to kind of get complacent in tech. And unfortunately, if you get complacent, you get your clock cleaned. That's why first mover matters. I think that's why details matter. And I think that's partly the sense of urgency, I guess, would be the thing that we've tried to kind of maintain. And we don't always have the answers in the beginning. But, if you have urgency and you're willing to have what we call a growth mindset and try to, how do you bring in the people that have expertise? For our data centers, one of the people I recruited that's been phenomenal for us, she came from Dow Chemical. She'd never worked in tech. She'd never worked in a data center before, but she knew how to run mission critical operations and how to build mission critical operations. She was a chemical engineer. And, that's kind of, how do you bring in expertise outside your comfort zone, outside, the network of people you've worked with to keep learning about energy, to learn about grids, to learn about data centers, to learn about AI. And I think that's something else that I think every company needs to keep doing is sort of have that sense of urgency. Don't be complacent. And
can we sit on that for a second, Scott? Because you just went there on talent.
Yep.
I mean, that innovation thing has to come with talent. I'd say one of the biggest stories around AI is the war for talent.
Yep.
So whether it's AI or more broadly across your business, how are you managing through that and kind of keeping the best and attracting the most innovative, both young and experienced?
I think especially for technology, talent is key. I think probably for any industry, talent is key. And I think not all talent is equal. And so I also think like, how do you have the absolute best talent? And I think the difference I've seen is sometimes if you have someone who is phenomenal, the output isn't just 20% better, it can be 10x better. And I think, part of what organizations need to do is keep finding ways to find that talent. Ideally you hire someone out of, university and they're in the career for 20 years, but also I think you need to recognize that often bringing in talent that's not been in your organization before brings a different set of perspective. And I do think for us in the early 2000s, part of the reason why we lost our way a little bit was we had too much of a monoculture. We had good people, but a lot of us had been at the company for 10, 15, 20 years. And so we thought alike. And especially in the early era of the cloud, one of the things we consciously did was say, okay, let's bring in people that haven't been here and that come from a startup background or come from a different technology background. And it's not necessarily they always had the better ideas. It was the fact that by having their perspective, having our long-term Microsoft perspective, we often came up to a better solution that was neither of the two perspectives. It was a fusion blending of the two.
Sure.
And just that kind of challenging of the ideas, the bouncing of the ideas, I think led to much better outcomes. And I would say some degree of consistency is good, but at the same time, I think you absolutely need to bring in fresh perspectives and almost be paranoid around how do you bring in new talent that's going to challenge the status quo internally. And then I think the other thing is just, whatever you can do to retain your top talent. And because they can sometimes be, 10x multipliers. And, I think that does, top talent wants to work with other top talent. And so, keeping a super high bar, I think is critical. I think, compensation is important, but at the end of the day, I think people care about hard problems and working with smart people that they're going to learn from, I found is often the best way to kind of attract talent and keep it. And it's not easy. And so if my saying this makes it sound like we've magically figured out the thing, we're figuring it out every day. And I think there's going to be always ways to learn and ways to do better. And I think that's also a key part of the mindset is just, you can always get smarter, you can always get better, and wake up every day and try to do both.
So a few closing questions, one slightly existential from a very successful South African global investor who said, are we creating the next dominant species, not through random genetic variation, but targeted silicon evolution?
I hope not. And I don't, I think with technology, obviously you got to use technology appropriately. But I do think if you think again, back to the evolution of, the smartphone, the web, the internal combustion engine, the steam engine, the telephone, all these things that at one point in time were fairly transformational and was going to be, the end of everything. And at some point they become kind of just part of our daily lives. And we don't even consciously think about how disruptive each of those technologies was. And in some ways, I think AI, does have an intelligence aspect to it, but it's not omniscient. It's not thinking. It is a powerful tool, but I don't think it ultimately is going to replace the powerful tools which are humans. But I do think it's going to become, part of our daily life. And I think in the same way that most of us couldn't imagine leaving our homes without our phones and ordering food or taxis or finding our way walking through the streets of a foreign city. I think AI is going to infuse itself into our lives, hopefully in productive, healthy ways. And I think the other thing in tech I would say is that people often overestimate the amount of impact in 2 years, and then they underestimate the amount of impact in 5 years. And, I think also this is, there's always going to be ups and downs with people saying this is going to change everything. And, I think even with AI, I think there's, people are saying, well, okay, it hasn't changed as much yet, or it's changing a little bit, but not as much as I thought. Again, I think if you ask that question in 5 years, we're going to find, every e-commerce website has got AI search and AI assisted chat built in. I think every financial service application and site is going to have the same built in. I think every consumer site is going to have that built in. And, I think we are going to find that this has just become part of our daily lives. And hopefully it's improved it and made us all happier, more productive, and society's gotten better.
You had a question?
Just, I've gone from a rather big place, not big by Microsoft standards. And we used to joke when we were together that we had the same initials, Microsoft and Morgan Stanley. But the dilemma I have with young people coming up is, you've done both. Should I go to a big company and get all the learnings that come with that and maybe a bit more structure and all that stuff? Or the new trend, or the last 10 years trend, is these young people coming out of university or out of graduate school want to go to startups. Do you have any thoughts on that one?
I think both can be good careers. I think the thing I'd encourage a new hire to look at as you're evaluating different opportunities is will you learn and what will you learn? And so I think it's absolutely possible to learn in a big company, and it's absolutely possible to learn in a startup. And I think the real trick is it the right company and the right startup? And if you feel like you're going to have mentors and you feel like you're going to be working with people that are better than you and that you'll learn from, I think that's always the thing to look for in a career. And I would say that even for me, I kind of, I always tell my team, I don't have all the answers. And the reason I enjoy coming to work in the day, every day is, or almost every day is, it's because I get to learn from people that are smarter than me. And I think in general, you always want to work with people that are smarter than you, because then you'll keep learning, and they might not be smarter on everything, but smarter in something. And if you can find that, you can both learn and have a great career. And I think that's true for both startups and big companies.
Great.
Who's the person that you are yet to meet that you'd like to have dinner with?
That's a good question. I've been fortunate to have dinner with a lot of people, but yeah, I think I'm a huge beyond technology. I've had dinner with a lot of people in technology, and there's a lot of people I do dinner with again. But I love history. So there's a lot of authors of history books. They're not maybe well-known names. It's like Robert Caro is a great historian of New York
City,
and Johnson, which hopefully he's going to finish his book. So hopefully he finishes his last book. I think he's 92, but he's still working on his book. And, there's a lot of authors I'd love to kind of actually brainstorm with, or historians, or, people that are outside of kind of mainstream media and mainstream tech. And that would always be interesting.
Great. Fantastic. So it's been great having you here today. We've been looking forward to this conversation. We normally summarize. I've taken 3 things away from this particularly, which is that, in your opinion, and I understand why, AI is going to be good for humanity, but it's not going to be equally distributed. Number 2, as you've given the illustration, when stuff is going on that isn't necessarily good, you use the expression fog of war. Actually, the new types of protocols available through AI can clear through some of that stuff in a much more effective way than the human brain can do, and that the secret to nurturing these organizations has been to increasingly hire talent from very different pools of previous experience. So they've taken those 3. Rob, did you have a conclusion or 2?
I just felt that your comment on we expect too much in 2 years and we don't expect enough in 5 years. And I think a reminder that these phones of ours that we can't separate ourselves from, that's a less than 20-year reality. And it's just to your point on London and how you used to come and get around and how you do today. And I do think it's a little bit intimidating and a little scary, but super exciting to think about what the next 5 and 10 years are going to look like.
Great. Well, it's been fantastic having you both here today. Thank you.
Thank you,
Simon.
Super. Great to be here.
All content on the Money Maze podcast is for your general information and use only, and is not intended to address your particular requirements. In particular, the content does not constitute any form of advice, recommendation, representation, endorsement, or arrangement, and is not intended to be relied upon by users in making any specific investment or other decisions. Guests and presenters may have positions in any of the investments discussed.